Chalk dust floated in the air as the students laughed. The teacher stood before the board, smirking, pointing toward the janitor who had paused mid-mop. The math problem behind her was a maze of symbols that even the brightest student could not solve. Her voice dripped with arrogance as she gestured toward him, her eyes gleaming with mockery. The room buzzed with cruel amusement. But then, the janitor placed his mop aside. He stepped closer to the board, silent and steady. When his hand reached for the chalk, the laughter began to die. Something extraordinary was about to happen. If you believe in stories that expose truth and inspire change, subscribe to Racism Untold Stories. Join us as we reveal the moments when prejudice meets its match and humanity learns a lesson it will never forget. The morning sun had barely risen above the small suburban skyline when Elijah Turner arrived at Ashwood High School. The air outside was still heavy with mist, and the frost on the parking lot sparkled faintly beneath the pale light. Elijah's worn-out boots crunched softly against the pavement as he unlocked the maintenance door and pushed his cleaning cart through the narrow hallway. The smell of disinfectant lingered faintly in the air, mixed with the distant aroma of brewing coffee from the teacher's lounge. Inside the quiet corridors, the school felt different. Before the chatter of students filled the air, before footsteps echoed off the tiled floors, there was only stillness. The kind of stillness that belonged to the invisible workers who prepared the world for others to occupy. Elijah moved methodically, as he always did. He took pride in order and routine. Every morning he wiped the glass of the entrance doors until they gleamed, polished the brass nameplates outside classrooms, and mopped the marble floor of the main hall until it reflected the ceiling lights. His hands were rough from years of labor, but there was a precision in his touch that revealed something more. A quiet intelligence hidden beneath the uniform and the gloves. The walls of Ashwood High were lined with photographs of smiling students and trophies gleaming behind glass. They celebrated academic excellence, athletic victories, and artistic talent. Elijah often paused before them as he cleaned, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. Behind every smiling face was a future unburdened by the struggles that had defined his life. He had once dreamed of a similar photograph, of wearing a cap and gown, of standing on a stage holding a degree that bore his name. He had been a brilliant student once, the kind of mind that could see solutions where others saw confusion. Numbers had always been his refuge. They did not judge or discriminate. They obeyed logic and symmetry. They offered beauty that no prejudice could taint. But life had other plans. He was born in a small town where opportunities were scarce and expectations for boys like him even lower. His mother worked double shifts at a diner, and his father, a quiet man of principle, had died young from exhaustion and factory fumes. Elijah had been offered a scholarship to a state university, but when his mother fell ill, the scholarship funds became hospital bills. One decision, the decision to care for family, had changed everything. He took a job as a janitor at a local building, believing it would be temporary. Yet, temporary became years, and years became a way of life. Still, he carried his mind like a hidden jewel, polishing it quietly in the shadows where no one cared to look. By the time he joined Ashwood High, Elijah had accepted the rhythm of invisibility. He worked when others rested, cleaned what others dirtied, and watched silently as the world moved past him. He never complained. His humility was often mistaken for simplicity, his silence for ignorance. One of the teachers he saw most often was Ms. Caldwell, who taught advanced mathematics in room 204. She was in her mid-30s, tall, composed, and impossibly confident. Her classroom was a kingdom of precision, desks aligned perfectly, chalk arranged by size, and equations that covered every inch of the blackboard. To her students, she represented authority and brilliance. To her peers, she was both admired and quietly resented for her arrogance. Ms. Caldwell believed deeply in hierarchy, in the order of things. To her, intellect was visible, measurable, and confined to the educated elite. She often spoke about potential and standards, words that sounded noble but were edged with quiet prejudice. She did not notice Elijah much. When she did, it was only to complain about a light bulb that flickered or a window that needed cleaning. She rarely said thank you, not because she was cruel, but because she saw him as part of the background, a fixture of maintenance, not a man. That particular morning, the air was charged with the nervous energy of an upcoming academic competition. Ms. Caldwell's class had been preparing for weeks. Her best students were expected to solve a notoriously difficult equation as part of a qualifying exam. The problem was printed on the board in large, looping characters, a complex system of differential equations, symbols weaving together like a riddle. When Elijah entered the room, the lesson was already in full swing. Ms. Caldwell stood before the class with a piece of chalk in hand, her sharp heels clicking softly as she paced. The students watched her with strained faces, their notebooks filled with attempts that went nowhere. Elijah carried his mop bucket and cleaning supplies quietly to the corner of the room, careful not to interrupt. He listened as she lectured about logic, precision, and the beauty of mathematical structure. The words echoed through him like music he had once known by heart. He could see the problem from where he stood. The equation called to him in a way few things did anymore. The pattern was familiar, elegant, intricate, yet entirely solvable. He felt the urge to pick up a piece of chalk and finish it, but he knew better than to draw attention to himself. Ms. Caldwell, however, noticed his lingering glance. Her eyes flickered briefly toward him, a small, sharp look of disapproval, as if his presence near her board was an intrusion into a sacred space. The class continued to struggle. Groans filled the air as students whispered among themselves, some frustrated, others pretending to understand. Ms. Caldwell's patience thinned. At one point, she sighed dramatically and placed her chalk down. "It appears," she said, "that no one here has the answer. Perhaps this problem is too advanced for you?" The class shifted uneasily. Some chuckled, others looked down. Elijah continued mopping, trying to fade into the background again. Then, almost as an afterthought, Ms. Caldwell turned her head slightly toward him. "Perhaps," she said, her voice laced with a cold kind of humor, "our janitor would like to try." The class erupted in laughter. The sound rolled through the room like a wave of mockery, sharp and careless. Some students covered their mouths, others grinned openly. The joke was not meant to be cruel, only harmless fun, the kind of everyday disrespect that hides behind laughter. Elijah froze for a moment, the mop handle still in his hand. His heart did not quicken, but something deep inside him stirred, not anger, but clarity. He looked at the board once more, his mind already tracing invisible lines of logic through the air. Ms. Caldwell waited, her smirk faint but unmistakable. She expected embarrassment, perhaps a nervous laugh or a quiet retreat. But Elijah did not move away. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned the mop against the wall and walked toward the board. The laughter began to fade as the rhythm of his footsteps filled the silence. The students' smiles faltered. The teacher's expression shifted from amusement to confusion. Elijah stopped a few feet from the equation. His eyes scanned the symbols with calm precision. In that instant, the classroom became a theater of tension, the kind of silence that holds its breath before revelation. The janitor stood before the board not as a man mocked by circumstance, but as a scholar rediscovering his language. And though no one knew it yet, this was the moment when truth began to stir. The moment when the world's assumptions would begin to unravel, one line of chalk at a time. The classroom hung in a delicate silence as Elijah stood before the board. The scent of chalk mixed with the faint tang of cleaning solution that still lingered in the air from his morning work. For a moment, time itself seemed suspended. The laughter had stopped, The murmurs had died, and even the steady hum of the fluorescent lights felt distant. Every eye in the room was fixed on the janitor, the man they had dismissed without thought only seconds before. Elijah's hand hovered near the chalk for a brief moment, as though he was reacquainting himself with an old friend. His fingers, rough and calloused from years of labor, closed gently around the slender piece. The white dust clung to his skin, and in that small, quiet gesture, the balance of the room shifted. The teacher's mockery began to tremble under the weight of what was about to unfold. Miss Caldwell watched with narrowed eyes. She expected hesitation. She expected confusion. She expected him to falter quickly so that she could end the joke, reclaim her authority, and move on. But Elijah did not falter. He began to write. At first, his movements were slow, deliberate, and measured. The chalk squeaked lightly across the surface of the blackboard, forming careful symbols and curves that linked together like notes in a melody. The problem was not a simple one. It involved multiple variables, a system of non-linear differentials that even her brightest students had failed to comprehend. Yet the way Elijah approached it was unlike anything the class had seen before. There was rhythm in his work. He stepped back often to examine what he had written, then leaned forward to continue, his eyes scanning every line as if he was reading music only he could hear. The students exchanged glances, some curious, others skeptical. They whispered to one another in uneasy tones, the nervous energy of disbelief rippling through the room. Ms. Caldwell crossed her arms tightly. She tried to maintain her composure, but her curiosity was beginning to gnaw at the edges of her confidence. She told herself that he was merely copying symbols without understanding them, that this would soon end in embarrassment. Yet something about his posture, calm, certain, unhurried, unsettled her. Elijah's mind was alive in a way it had not been for years. The numbers spoke to him again, like voices returning from a forgotten past. He saw patterns where others saw chaos, symmetry where others saw confusion. The years of silence had not dulled his intellect. They had refined it, sharpened it into quiet mastery. He remembered his old notebooks filled with equations and scribbled notes. He remembered solving complex theorems by candlelight when the power went out in his small apartment, driven by nothing but passion and perseverance. All those years of invisibility had never erased the part of him that loved the logic of truth. Now, standing before a classroom full of privileged young minds, he was rediscovering himself. Minutes passed. The board began to fill with symbols, partial derivatives, limits, substitutions, all flowing seamlessly together into an elegant structure of reasoning. The students, once restless, were now silent. The laughter that had mocked him minutes before was gone, replaced by awe and discomfort. They could sense that something remarkable was happening, even if they did not yet understand it. Ms. Caldwell's smirk had vanished entirely. She stepped closer to the board, trying to follow his work, but the progression of his thought was beyond her prediction. His steps were not random. Each line was a bridge to the next, every symbol serving a purpose that fit into a grander logic. The simplicity of his approach was what startled her the most. He was solving with an intuition that no textbook could teach. As the final expression emerged, a realization began to dawn. Elijah was not merely solving the problem, he was rewriting it in a more elegant form. The students leaned forward, their eyes wide. They could see the flow, the inevitability, the beauty of what he was constructing. He stepped aside for a moment, reading the entire equation from top to bottom. Then, with a faint smile, wrote the final answer in a clean, steady motion. It was correct. Perfectly correct. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. For a few seconds, no one moved. No one even breathed. Then, almost involuntarily, one of the students whispered, "He did it." Ms. Caldwell's eyes widened slightly as she examined the board. Her mind retraced each step, searching for error, for oversight, for something she could use to reassert her superiority. But there was none. Every calculation was precise, every transformation justified. It was a flawless solution. Elijah placed the chalk down gently on the ledge of the board and wiped his hands against his uniform. His eyes did not boast, and his face did not seek applause. He simply turned and gave a small nod toward the class, as if acknowledging that his part was done. Then he quietly walked back to his mop and resumed cleaning the floor. The contrast was almost unbearable to watch. The same man who had just demonstrated mastery over an equation that no student could solve was now back to pushing a mop, as if nothing significant had happened. His humility, his composure, only deepened the silence in the room. The students looked at him differently now, not as a janitor, but as someone inexplicably greater. Ms. Caldwell stood frozen. Her pride wrestled with the shock that churned inside her. She had wanted to humiliate him, but she had humiliated herself instead. The image of her own arrogance reflected sharply in the still water of Elijah's composure. After several moments, she found her voice again, though it trembled slightly when she spoke. "Class dismissed," she said softly. Her usual commanding tone had vanished. As the students left, whispers followed Elijah like a trail of wind. Some lingered near the door, stealing glances back at him. One student, a quiet boy from the back row, hesitated before leaving and said in a low, awed voice, "Sir, that was incredible." Elijah did not respond. He simply nodded again, his expression unreadable, and continued to mop the floor as the boy slipped away. When the last student was gone, Ms. Caldwell remained standing at her desk, staring at the board. She traced the lines of the solution with her eyes, each stroke of chalk like a mirror, reflecting her own misplaced assumptions. The words she had used so casually, "Perhaps the janitor would like to try," now echoed in her mind like an accusation. Outside the window, the first snow of the season began to fall. Tiny flakes landed softly against the glass, melting slowly. Elijah finished his work, emptied his mop bucket, and gathered his tools. As he pushed his cart toward the door, he paused for a moment and turned his gaze toward the blackboard. The white equations gleamed faintly against the dark surface. He felt no pride, only peace, a quiet satisfaction that came not from proving anyone wrong, but from finally being allowed, if only for a moment, to be seen for who he truly was. Ms. Caldwell looked up, her voice unsteady. "Mr. Turner," she said quietly, "how did you—" He stopped her gently with a small shake of his head. "It is only mathematics," he said softly, his tone calm and steady. Then he walked out, leaving her alone in the room, surrounded by the truth he had written in chalk, truth that could not be erased. That night, Ms. Caldwell stayed late in her classroom. She stared at the equation over and over, but it was no longer just a problem to her. It was a revelation, one that spoke not of numbers, but of human worth, and the blindness of those who think intellect and dignity come dressed in fine clothes. By the time she finally erased the board, her hand was trembling. The chalk dust clung to her fingers, just as it had to his. And in that moment, for the first time in her career, she felt the weight of humility. Outside, Elijah walked home under the streetlights, his shadow long and solitary across the pavement. He carried nothing but his worn jacket and the quiet satisfaction of a man who no longer needed recognition to prove the truth, because the truth had already spoken for him. By the next morning, the quiet corridors of Ashwood High buzzed with whispers. What had begun as a moment of laughter in one classroom had transformed into a story spreading across the entire school. Students spoke about it in hushed tones near their lockers. Teachers exchanged skeptical looks in the staff room. Some believed the rumor, others dismissed it as exaggeration. But by the time the first period bell rang, there was no denying it anymore. A video clip had begun circulating on social media. The moment Elijah picked up the chalk, his calm precision, the transformation of the room's laughter into awe. Someone had recorded it discreetly from the back of the class. Within hours, hundreds of students had watched it. By the end of the day, the clip had been shared beyond the school. The janitor had become a symbol of something far greater than anyone expected. Elijah himself was unaware of the digital storm. He arrived at school the same way he always did, before sunrise, pushing his cart through the hallways, polishing floors, emptying trash bins, and ensuring that everything gleamed before students arrived. He worked quietly, humming under his breath. He did not see the glances that followed him, the awe mingled with guilt that now colored the way people looked at him. When he entered Ms. Caldwell's classroom that morning, she was already there. Her usual air of superiority was gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier. The equation from the previous day had been erased, but traces of chalk remained like faint ghosts on the board, reminders of what had happened. Elijah nodded politely as he passed her desk. He did not expect acknowledgement. He was used to silence. But today, Ms. Caldwell's voice stopped him. "Mr. Turner," she said softly, "may I speak with you for a moment?" He paused, unsure of her intent, and set his cleaning supplies aside. The classroom was empty except for them. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, eyes uncertain. "I owe you an apology," she began, her tone stripped of pride. "Yesterday I made a cruel assumption. I turned your presence into a spectacle. I judged your worth without ever knowing you, and I see now how wrong that was." Elijah looked at her for a long moment. There was no anger in his expression, only quiet understanding. "We all make mistakes, Ms. Caldwell," he said gently. "What matters is whether we learn from them." His words were calm, but they carried a gravity that made her lower her eyes. She nodded, her throat tightening. Before either of them could continue, the classroom door opened, and the principal entered, accompanied by another man, older, wearing a suit, holding a clipboard. The atmosphere shifted immediately. "Elijah Turner," the principal said, his tone polite but uncertain. "This is Dr. Hampton from the local community college. He would like to meet you." Elijah blinked, startled. "Meet me?" "Yes," Dr. Hampton said, stepping forward with an extended hand. "I saw the video. I run the mathematics department at Westfield Community College. I wanted to confirm for myself what I saw. You solved a problem that many graduate students struggle with. I would like to talk to you about that." The offer hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Ms. Caldwell looked between them, her eyes widening slightly. The irony of the moment struck her. The very man she had mocked was now being recognized for the brilliance she had ignored. Elijah hesitated, humility rising before pride. "I appreciate your kindness, sir," he said slowly, "but I am no mathematician. I only used to study a little a long time ago." Dr. Hampton smiled. "That may be true, but talent like that does not disappear. We would like you to visit our department, perhaps assist with some tutoring, maybe even resume your studies. We can arrange it around your work schedule." The words felt unreal to Elijah. For a long time, he had believed that the doors of learning had closed permanently for him. He had accepted the silence of forgotten dreams. Yet now those very doors were opening again, not through privilege, but through truth revealed in the simplest of ways. He nodded slowly, his voice low but steady. "I would like that very much, sir." The principal smiled awkwardly, as if unsure how to react to the unfolding transformation. Ms. Caldwell stood still, her heart tightening with a mix of relief and regret. The very walls of her classroom seemed to echo with the lesson she had refused to learn. That greatness is not dictated by profession or appearance. As the day went on, students began to approach Elijah in the hallways. Some offered shy smiles, others mumbled words of apology or admiration. He accepted them all with quiet grace. To him, The true victory was not in being praised, but in seeing young minds beginning to question what they had once believed. By lunchtime, the school auditorium was full. The principal had arranged a special announcement, prompted by the story's growing attention. Faculty members, students, and local journalists gathered. Cameras flashed. The atmosphere carried the weight of an event far greater than anyone had expected. Elijah stood on the stage, uncertain and humble, surrounded by people who had once overlooked him. Ms. Caldwell sat in the front row, her eyes glistening. The principal spoke briefly, introducing him as a valued member of our school community whose recent demonstration of intellect and perseverance has inspired us all. When it was Elijah's turn to speak, he took a step forward. The microphone felt foreign in his hand. The lights shone bright, but his voice was steady. "I thank you all for your kindness," he began. "But I am not here because of a single equation. I am here because a moment of misunderstanding became a moment of truth. Sometimes, the world measures people by their uniforms, their titles, or their paychecks. But intelligence, compassion, and dignity cannot be measured that way." He paused, letting his words settle. The room was silent. "I spent many years cleaning classrooms where knowledge was shared," he continued. "And in those years, I learned that true education is not about who teaches and who listens. It is about how open we are to seeing the light in others, even when we think they have none." Ms. Caldwell lowered her gaze, tears gathering in her eyes. The truth of his words struck her deeper than any reprimand ever could. Elijah ended with a faint smile. "I did not solve that problem to prove anything. I did it because I love learning. And I hope every one of you never stops learning, especially about the people you think you already understand." When he stepped back, the room erupted into applause. Some clapped politely, others with emotion, and some stood in silent reverence. It was not a celebration of intellect, but of humility, grace, and the triumph of truth over prejudice. As the applause faded, Ms. Caldwell rose from her seat and approached the stage. She extended her hand to him. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Turner, thank you for reminding us what teaching truly means." He took her hand gently. There was no resentment in his eyes, only forgiveness. The cameras flashed again, capturing the image that would soon appear in newspapers and online articles. A humble janitor and a proud teacher standing together. The board of mathematics behind them erased but remembered. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and silent, blanketing the world in white, as if to cleanse it of old assumptions, to write a new equation upon its surface. That evening, when Elijah walked home beneath the pale winter sky, he did not feel triumphant. He felt peaceful. The world had seen his truth, and that was enough. He had not only solved a mathematical problem, he had solved a far deeper one. The equation of dignity against prejudice, of humility against pride. And for the first time in a long while, Elijah Turner allowed himself to smile. Not because he had been proven right, but because humanity, for once, had been given a chance to learn. In the days that followed Elijah Turner's quiet triumph, the world around Ashwood High began to shift in subtle yet profound ways. What had once been a place defined by hierarchy, teachers above students, students above janitors, appearances above truth, began to feel different. There was an awareness now, a quiet reckoning that rippled through the hallways like a change in the air itself. The video of Elijah's equation had reached far beyond the school walls. Local news outlets picked it up, then national networks. They called it "The Janitor Who Solved the Equation." Headlines praised his humility and intellect, but beneath the surface, the real story resonated more deeply. The story of a man who had been invisible until the moment he could no longer be ignored. Elijah, however, never sought fame. He continued his work as always, arriving before sunrise, broom in hand, his footsteps echoing softly through the halls. When students saw him now, they greeted him with respect. Some stopped to talk to him, asking about the equation, about mathematics, about life. He always smiled and answered with patience, never forgetting the quiet years when no one had spoken to him at all. One morning he found a small envelope on his cart. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "Mr. Turner, you have inspired me more than any textbook ever could. I used to believe that people were defined by what they wore or how much they earned. You showed me that wisdom can come from anywhere. Thank you for teaching me to look deeper." It was signed, simply, a student. He folded the note carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket. It was a small gesture, but to him it meant everything. Meanwhile, Ms. Caldwell underwent a quiet transformation of her own. The woman who once dismissed others with an air of superiority found herself pausing before she spoke, listening before she judged. She began to incorporate lessons into her classroom about humility, empathy, and the value of unseen intelligence. One day, as she erased the board after class, she noticed Elijah sweeping near the doorway. She turned to him, a gentle smile on her face. "I have been teaching for 15 years, she said softly, "but I think I learned more from you in one afternoon than in all those years combined." Elijah chuckled quietly. "We all teach in different ways, Miss Caldwell. Sometimes the lesson comes when we least expect it." She nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. In time, the school introduced a new program, the Turner Initiative for Hidden Talent. It was designed to support underprivileged adults and students who had once fallen through the cracks of opportunity. Scholarships were funded through donations that poured in after Elijah's story went viral. For the first time, janitors, cafeteria workers, and maintenance staff were invited to free evening classes at the local community college. The first night the program launched, the auditorium was full. Dr. Hampton stood at the front, addressing the crowd with pride. At his side was Elijah Turner, no longer just a custodian, but a guest lecturer and mentor. When he stepped up to speak, there was no grand speech this time, just a simple truth. "I spent years walking these halls thinking my time had passed," he said. "But the truth is, learning never ends, unless we decide it should. No matter who you are or where you stand, your worth is not determined by how others see you. It is determined by the light you choose to carry within." Applause filled the room. Some wept quietly, others sat in silence, letting his words settle deep within their hearts. After the event, Elijah was offered a part-time position at Westfield Community College, assisting in mathematics tutoring. He accepted, not out of pride, but out of gratitude. He continued to work at Ashwood High during the mornings, cleaning classrooms where young minds grew, and spent his afternoons helping students rediscover their own potential. One evening, long after everyone had left, Elijah stood alone in the classroom where it all began. The faint scent of chalk lingered in the air. The same board stood before him, wiped clean, but the memory of that equation still lived in its surface. He drew a single line across the board, then wrote in neat, precise letters, "Knowledge has no rank. Dignity has no uniform." He looked at the words for a long moment, then smiled faintly and turned off the lights. The months rolled on. Seasons changed. Snow melted into spring, and spring gave way to the warmth of summer. Life at Ashwood High resumed its rhythm, but the tone of it had changed permanently. Students spoke differently to the janitors now. Teachers made an effort to greet staff members they had once overlooked. A quiet culture of respect had taken root, nurtured by the legacy of one man's humility. Elijah's story continued to inspire beyond the walls of the school. Universities reached out. Conferences requested him as a speaker, but he always declined politely, saying, "I am where I am meant to be." Yet perhaps the most profound transformation occurred not in classrooms or on stages, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed his grace firsthand. Ms. Caldwell, now deeply reflective, began a new teaching module titled The Equation of Empathy. She told her students the story of Elijah Turner, not as a lesson in mathematics, but as a lesson in humanity. Her students listened in rapt attention, many unaware that the man she spoke of still walked the halls every morning. She would end her lesson the same way each time. Greatness is not always loud. Sometimes it sweeps the floor when no one is watching. Years later, when Elijah finally retired, the school held an assembly in his honor. The auditorium was filled once again. Students, teachers, staff, and community members all gathered to celebrate him. They presented him with a plaque that read, "In honor of Elijah Turner, the man who reminded us that knowledge has no boundaries, and that every life, no matter how overlooked, holds infinite worth." As he accepted it, Elijah felt a deep peace settle in his heart. He had spent his life in quiet service, and now, that quiet had spoken louder than any fame ever could. That evening, as he walked home beneath the orange glow of sunset, children played in the distance, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. The breeze was gentle, the air soft. He stopped for a moment and looked up at the sky, whispering a simple prayer of gratitude. For once, he did not feel unseen. The world had learned his name, but more importantly, it had learned his lesson. And somewhere deep within the quiet corridors of Ashwood High, his legacy continued. Not on the walls, not in the textbooks, but in the changed hearts of those who had finally learned to see beyond the surface. If Elijah's story touched your heart, share it so others can see the power of dignity, humility, and unseen brilliance. Let this remind us all. Greatness is not about titles or recognition, but about the light we bring into the world through kindness and truth. Stand up for respect. Look deeper. See beyond appearances, because sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the loudest truth.